Welcome to Tune In Tuesday, Chapter 5, Session 3B, titled Ezra and Esther. I left you with Ezra in the last session, a great scholar and teacher of the Word who influenced Judaism almost as much as Moses. But Ezra was not a prophet like those who preceded him. He was a teacher like Moses, but he also was a sage like Solomon. The body of Scripture is instruction in righteousness, and that instruction has many facets, and God's prophets colored in its various parts. But in order to understand this completely, we need to acknowledge that a prophet's main job is to speak for God. Many people think that they are to tell the future, but the main job of a prophet is to tell forth, not F-O-R-E tell, but F-O-R-T-H tell, what God wants known. Now, of course, a portion of that message does include predicting the future and foretelling events. And that part of it is both a certification of that prophet's office, it's proof that they're a prophet, and also it is proof of God's omniscience and eternality, because it's proof that God knows what's happening in the future, and only God can know that. But foretelling the future was not always the main message of prophets. They also called believers back to God. The Old Testament prophets in their variety foreshadowed the ministers of the New Testament in their variety as well. Every man or woman of God who has risen up has had a mission and a method and a message that God's entrusted to them. It was and is their heart song. Their stars shine in the galaxy of God's truth. It's their contribution to the body of material known about spiritual matters. Sometimes what they speak is new light. Sometimes it's a restatement of light. Sometimes it's the rediscovery of forgotten light and a calling back to it. For example, Moses' ministry and prophecy was doctrine and reproof, and his heart's quest was, Lord, what is the significance of your name? He championed that cause. Joshua, his ministry, he was a leader and a maintainer to observe and to do according to all the law of Moses had commanded. And his mission was to take the land God had promised. The judges that followed, they were deliverers and maintainers and enforcers of the law. Samuel called believers back to the law of Moses after Eli's failure, and Samuel's heart's quest was chief intercessor. He repaired Eli's damage, and he also founded the kingdom. Then his song was to praise God for his great mercy. David also established and expanded the kingdom. These are the facets of their ministries. Solomon was a model sage. He proclaimed God's great wisdom, and he built the temple. The next ranks of prophets called Israel back to God and foretold the consequences of disobedience. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel were the chief among them. Isaiah also foretold the Messiah and the millennial kingdom. These prophets advised kings in that cataclysmic spiritual battle that raged around the nexuses of power in the ancient world, and Daniel was chief in that respect. Now, into this galaxy, we now have seen the glow of Ezra's star. His ministry combined elements of Moses and Solomon. He became the model for the sages of the future in Judaism, like Hillel and Gamaliel, who extolled and taught the law. Judaism in the next centuries was established in Jewish community synagogues across the known world due to reforms attributed to Ezra. Some even attribute the establishment of synagogues to him. However, in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 33, it talks about the people were assembling somewhere to hear Ezekiel. Although, to be an official synagogue, they needed to own a Torah scroll, and I believe that the synagogue readings and prayers were instituted by Ezra. So it's hard to tell. The past is murky, and as usual, there's differing opinions among the rabbis of these things. But I think the majority agree that Ezra's greatest contribution was the standardization of the scriptures. He, like his great-grandfather, the high priest Hilkiah, are associated with reviving the law. Hilkiah was the one who found that scroll of the Torah in 2 Kings 22:8, when they were refurbishing the temple during the reign of Josiah. This was after a period of neglect under the kings Manasseh and Ammon. Consequently, I believe that Ezra had dedicated himself that this would never happen again. In addition to the things I mentioned in the last session, Ezra's movement standardized the biblical text and assembled all the books and determined which books were legitimate. Some of the Apocrypha existed at that time, and they were excluded because of unfulfilled prophecy. The scribes then made many copies of the scriptures which were used in the synagogues around the Mediterranean and throughout the Middle East. And never again would books be lost or be reduced to having only one copy left. The Masoretes then took over the work of the Sopharim, and the Hebrew Bible spread around the world. Now, while I was doing my teaching prep for this session, I confirmed another facet of Wren's work on chronology, and I wrote Wren a letter. And I'll just quote you the letter I wrote to Wren. Quote, "Just like the age of Mordecai confirms that Esther's husband was Darius I, Ezra's age does the same thing, cementing his place in biblical chronology. And the more puzzle pieces fit, the clearer the picture becomes, and the stronger our case about chronology becomes. And the proof here is in Ezra's genealogy. Take a look at Ezra chapter 7. Ezra chapter 7, verse 1 through 5, gives his genealogy. Verse 1, "After these things, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, the son of Seraiah, the son of Azariah, the son of Hilkiah," and it goes all the way back to Aaron in verse 5. Now, there's another place that the high priest genealogy is given, and that's in 1 Chronicles 6. And there in 1 Chronicles 6, verse 15, in the genealogy, it says that Jehozadak went into captivity when the Lord carried away Judah and Jerusalem by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And there also, in 1 Chronicles 6, it says that Seraiah was Jehozadak's father. Well, Ezra's genealogy tells us that Seraiah was also Ezra's father. But Chronicles and Kings say that Seraiah, Ezra's father and Jehozadak's father, was killed by Nebuchadnezzar in 2 Kings 25, verse 18 through 21. And that occurred in 587 BC when the siege of Jerusalem ended and the temple was destroyed. They took them out to Riblah and killed them there along with a number of other people, dignitaries from Jerusalem. So, if Seraiah was Ezra's father and he died in 587 BC, a minimum age for Ezra, and this would allow him to be born even after his father died if his mom was still expecting, his minimum age would be 70 years old when he came to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Darius the First. All right? Now, we know that when the temple was rebuilt, Jeshua was the high priest, the son of Jehozadak or Jozadak or Josedek. There's several different spellings. And that is that one who was a son of Seraiah. So Ezra was this Jeshua, the son of Jehozadak's uncle. When they came back from Jerusalem, Jeshua was the one that came with Zerubbabel. He was the high priest when the temple was rebuilt. And Ezra was Jeshua's uncle. So, because of all the ages, this fits together perfect. But if Ezra had come to Jerusalem in Xerxes' 7th year, then he would have had to have been 107 years old. And, like many people believe, if he had come during Artaxerxes' reign, he would have had to have been 128 years old. Of course, those last two are not possible. So, Ezra's age at 70 years old when he came back during Darius the First's 7th year is proof for our chronology, Bren's chronology, and that the books of Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah all occurred primarily during the reign of Darius the First. All other scenarios are impossible. The fact that Hilkiah, Ezra's great-grandfather, found the book of the law in 2 Kings 22:8 also proves another point concerning Ezra. There are some theologians who believe that the Bible wasn't even written until this point. They say Ezra oversaw the Bible being written. Well, that can't be true if they found a book of the law 125 years before Ezra preached in Jerusalem. Hilkiah found it. Therefore, Ezra and his scribes couldn't have written the word for the first time. As I said in the last session, they edited it. They changed the character set. They added the spaces, those final letters, and also the vowel, the quiescent consonants. Okay? They had to edit something. Well, what did they edit? So, the scriptures had to predate Ezra. See? Let's read that passage in 2 Kings 22 about what Ezra's great-grandfather found. 2 Kings 22:8. Here it says, Hilkiah, the high priest, said unto Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. They had lost it. Verse 9, and Shaphan the scribe came to the king, and brought the king, this is King Josiah, word, and said, Thy servants have gathered the money that was found in the house. They've delivered it into the hand of them that do the work, that have the oversight of the house of the Lord. And Shaphan the scribe showed the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest delivered me a book. This is a scroll. And Shaphan read it before the king. And it came to pass, when the king had heard the words of the book of the law, he rent his clothes. And the king commanded Hilkiah the priest, and Ahikam the son of Shaphan, and Ichbor the son of Machiah, and Shaphan the scribe, and Azariah the servant of the king, saying, Go, ye inquire of the Lord for me, and for the people, and for all Judah, concerning the words of this book that's found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that's kindled against us, because our fathers have not hearkened unto the words of this book. They lost it, to do according to all that which is written concerning us. Verse 14, so Hilkiah the priest, and Ahikam, and Achbor, and Shaphan, and Azariah went to Huldah the prophetess, the wife of Shallum, the son of Tikvah, the son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. Now she dwelt in Jerusalem in the college, and they communed with her. So then they consulted the prophetess regarding the consequences of losing track of the scriptures. I thought it was a good idea, though, to see what Bullinger said. And I found a real gem in his note in the Companion Bible for 2 Kings 22:8. He said that what they found was, quote, the original copy of the Pentateuch laid up by the side of the ark that Deuteronomy 31, verse 24 through 26 talked about. And he said it was probably secreted or hidden during the reigns of Manasseh and Ammon. So let's look at Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 31, verse 24. It came to pass, when Moses had made an end of writing the words of this law in a book, until they were finished, that Moses commanded the Levites, which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, Take this book of the law, and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against thee. Now also, Bullinger included an appendix, number 47, in the Companion Bible on this subject. And I'm going to give you a PDF of Appendix 47. This is titled The Book of the Law, from Appendix 47, Companion Bible. Quote, it is an allegation of higher criticism, with dispenses with documentary or manuscript evidence, and therefore differs altogether from textual criticism, that the 5 books known as the Pentateuch were not written by or during the time of Moses. That's what they say. But in the time of King Manasseh, or even as late as Ezra. But he says a definite quote-unquote book is spoken of throughout the Old Testament as being constantly written in, with directions how it was to be added to, and kept up by the prophets, raised up from time to time for that purpose, among others. And so then he lists, let's see here, 32 different references to this book being in existence. Okay? For example, in Exodus 24, verse 4 and 7, it was written by Moses, and the book was sprinkled with blood. Well, he sprinkled something on something, right? Numbers 33, verse 1 and 2 is written by Moses, quote, by the commandment of Jehovah. And then, let's see here, Deuteronomy 17:18, the book was kept, quote, before the priests of the Levites, and to be copied by the king. All right? So when a king came on the scene, one of the things the king was supposed to do was to have a copy of this book. Well, the book had to exist then. All right? Joshua was charged in chapter 1, verse 8, this book of the law. So there was a book of the law that Joshua was charged to keep. All right? In Joshua 23, verse 6 and 7, and also it's referred to in Joshua 24, verse 26, where Joshua himself, quote, wrote in the book. Well, if you want to figure out how the last chapter of Deuteronomy was added that talked about the death of Moses, well, Moses couldn't have written that, but Joshua could. All right? So Samuel continued writing in the book in 1 Samuel 10:25. So all the way through, like Hezekiah's Passover was kept in the second month, quote, as it was written. All right, 2 Chronicles 30, verse 2, 5, and 18. So this appendix gives you places throughout the Bible that refer to the book having or being in existence. So, and it was written. It wasn't just oral. Again, also throughout this class, I have pointed out evidence regarding why we believe that the schools of the prophets were the caretakers of the books of the prophets, and that the books of Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles were compiled by God-inspired editors from no longer extant books of other prophets, but they were mentioned what books they took them from in Kings and Chronicles, as well as they also excerpted official regal history in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah and of Israel. Now, we know that David had to have written his songs, because how are the singers and the musicians going to be able to perform them? Had to have written them. Solomon wrote Proverbs, and then it says that Hezekiah's scholars copied out more of his quotations. So they wrote, and then we know that all of the revelation that Jeremiah had received up to a certain point, he was commanded to dictate it to Baruch, who wrote it down. So Jeremiah had memorized all of the revelation he had received. And see, stuff like that is hard for us to conceive of because we don't have to memorize stuff. We have books. We have portable writing materials. We have digital recorders. We have recordings. So we don't have to use our minds to memorize stuff, and so we don't. But back then, they did. So to memorize the entire book of Jeremiah was not that far-fetched at all, especially if Jeremiah received it. God talking to you like that, that would be very memorable. Woo-hoo. But anyway, the word existed before the time of Ezra, and Ezra had something that he improved. He edited it, he changed the font, etc. Now, another gem I found during my research is there is a possibility that Psalm 119 was written by Ezra. Wow. I'm going to include a PDF on that. Now, what's neat about that is we just enjoyed a great class taught by Reverend Wayne Clapp on enjoying the Bible, and it was based on Psalm 119. And I think the scheduling of that was, if it was written by Ezra, would have been perfect. So I wrote Wayne a letter. I'll quote that letter too. I wrote him, "Hi Wayne, attached is an article stating a scholar's opinion that Ezra was the writer of Psalm 119. Of course, we have no way of knowing for sure, but just the possibility is delicious. I've known by the hand of God is upon me in my ministry, having miraculously delivered me from COVID-19, and there have been many epiphanies which I have had since my recovery that have contributed to the light in my classes. This timing could be similar. The scheduling and the efforts of Aaron and Cash to bring your teaching in at just the right time before we got to Ezra could be God's hand bringing in his perfection. Just think, if Ezra actually was its writer." Unquote. Wayne wrote back and said, "Thanks. I've checked into Ezra before. Hezekiah, too, was an alternative." And then Wayne said, "I so much wanted it to be David. Still don't think it can be nailed down." Agape Wayne G. Clapp. So that's really something, isn't it? That the possibility is that Ezra could have written Psalm 119. I agree. There's no way right now that we could confirm it, but it's nice to think about. The next piece of chronological and historical puzzle that we're putting together is the book of Esther. Tradition identifies Esther's husband as Xerxes. E.W. Bullinger disagrees, picking the father of Cyrus, Aristides, or Arsamas, which is Persian. But we have proven that Xerxes was too late and Arsamas was too early, and that the only candidate which fits all the details given in Scripture must be Darius I. So we're going to take a look at the book of Esther in the remaining time tonight. Esther chapter 1, verse 1, please. Esther chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this Ahasuerus which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. Now, Wren has shown us that the first key to identifying the correct monarch, that was Esther's husband, is to realize that Ahasuerus is an appellative, a throne name. Modern history commonly refers to the Persian kings, beginning with Cyrus, who conquered Babylon, but there were generations of Median and Persian kings before that. Cambyses, Cyrus's son, followed him in the throne, after which occurred a contention for rule, which Darius Hastapses, Darius I, eventually won. His reign was followed by who we call Xerxes I and Artaxerxes I. However, the Bible does not follow the same naming convention as we. It uses throne names, just like we say Your Majesty or Your Honor, and Wren's teaching straightened that all out. These throne names could be applied to any Persian ruler. So we have to rely upon other details in order to make a positive identification. So when the Bible uses these throne names in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, they are not to be confused with their modern historical assigned counterparts. The proof that this must be a throne name is readily apparent because of the existence of the parentheses that's there in Esther chapter 1, verse 1, because it talks about in the days of Ahasuerus, and then it explains, this is the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So why would it say that unless there were other kings that were referred to by that throne name? So that's why we know it's important to understand these things like Wren had taught. So who was this Ahasuerus? Well, Cyrus's father is disqualified because the borders of the empire were not yet to Ethiopia. All right? Cambyses was the one who conquered from India to Ethiopia, but Cambyses' reign did not last long enough to be a possibility for Ezra's husband because he only reigned about 7.5 years. Esther's husband reigned at least 12 years, as mentioned in Esther chapter 3, verse 7. All right? Well, we in Woohoo the Horse know about Darius's accession to the throne, but following any coup, there's always contention. Darius I accordingly had to immediately quell a number of revolts throughout the empire. he actually was occupied in fighting almost 20 battles in that first year throughout the empire to cement his position as king. So he was occupied with that and was not firmly in control until his third year. It was after this point that he could celebrate his achievement as described in Esther chapter 1, verse 2. Esther chapter 1, verse 2 through 4. That in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, he wasn't out fighting, he was there in his palace, which was in Shushan the palace. In the third year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. So, this was a grandiose event lasting 6 months. Now, the Behishtan inscription also displays a similar penchant for extravagant self-aggrandizement because the Behishtan inscription was like a huge billboard. It was 82 feet wide and 49 feet high, and it was carved onto the side of a mountain near a crossroads where everyone would see it. And this billboard, actually it was Darius the First's propaganda that he was the great king, was written in 3 languages, in Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. It proclaimed Darius the First's genealogy, his authority, and his triumph over all those who rebelled against him. And this propaganda was repeated in 3 languages. So it was just like the Rosetta Stone that unlocked the understanding of those languages. Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian were in the Behishtan inscription. The Rosetta Stone had Egyptian hieroglyphs, Greek, and Demotic, which was an Egyptian tongue. And so it likewise deciphered the unknown, the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Well, this Behishtan inscription, once they found out what one of the languages meant, it unlocked the other 2. But Darius had, I guess, a lavish for the extreme, a 6-month-long party. So, verse 9, Esther chapter 1, verse 9. So after this, Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. And on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Agbatha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment. She wasn't going to come out in front of a drunk king and his eunuchs. Therefore the king was very angry, and his anger burned in him. Verse 13, then the king said to the wise men, who knew the times, for so was the king's manner towards all that knew law and judgment. And next to him was Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marcina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat in the first in the kingdom. So these were his 7 nobles. These were in the court. And he said, what shall we do to the Queen Vashti according to the law? Because she's not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus. And Memucan answered before the king, and the princes said, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but to all the princes and to all the people that are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed to the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes when it shall be reported, the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate to another that's better than she is. And when the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all his empire, for it's great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both great and small. So, it was spoken by a man. Oh, jeez. But anyway, verse 21. And all this saying to please the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters to all the king's provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Well, all his advisors were men, and so they gave a typical male response. Chapter 2, verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered what he had done, what he had decreed. Verse 2. Then said the king's servants that ministered him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, to the custody of Hege, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. Verse 4, and let the maiden which pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. So, they decided to have a Miss Persia pageant, except they didn't have a swimsuit competition. Woo-hoo! Well, woo-hoo! How'd you get here? Woo-hoo, the horse? Bad horse, bad horse, bad. Verse 5. Now, in Shushan the palace thereof there was a certain Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So we have followed this in other sessions, and we know when this was, that carrying away. Verse 7, and he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, Haggai, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her the things for purification, which such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Verse 10, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. So, the crucial piece of information there is in verse 6, that Mordecai was in the carrying away when the Babylonians also took Jehoiachin. Ren's date for that is 597 BC. So, if Mordecai was a newborn when he was carried away in 597 BC, he would have been 75 years old, minimum, by our way of counting, when Darius I became king in 522 BC. And he would have been 87 years old, 12 years later, when Mordecai became the Grand Vizier in Esther chapter 9. Now, if Xerxes I were Esther's husband, Mordecai would have been 112 years old when Xerxes became king, and 124 when he became Grand Vizier. Well, it's not practical. So, Darius I had to be Esther's husband. Period. I don't care if most other historians say it was Xerxes. That's not possible. So, in verse 17, after the Miss Persia contest, the king loved Esther above all the women. She obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all the princes of his servants, even Esther's feast, and made a release to all the provinces, gave gifts according to the state of the king. But Esther had not showed her kindred or her people yet, like Mordecai had charged her. Verse 21, chapter 2, verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate. So the king's gate, that would be like the elders of the gate. So he was an advisor, like a judge, a dignitary. While Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth. They were angry and sought to lay hands on the king. Well, they weren't going to minister healing to him. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it to Esther, the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. When inquisition was made and the matter was found out, therefore they were both hanged on a tree. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. But nothing was done for Mordecai yet. But now the plot thickens. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him, and all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Wow. Verse 3, and then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you disobeying the king's commandment? Now it came to pass, when they spoke daily unto him, he hearkened not to them. So they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. For he told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow to him, nor did him reverence, Haman was full of wrath, and he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai, where Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. Genocide that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. So, now, we have to answer the question, why did Mordecai disrespect Haman? And also, why was Haman's response so out of proportion, not just to get even with Mordecai, but all the Jews throughout the empire? Genocide. Well, the key is the fact that Haman was an Agagite. You remember back when Saul failed what Samuel told him? You remember what the task was? Saul was supposed to get rid of the Amalekites. Now, that's radical, to get rid of a whole people. Well, why did God say that? It was justly commanded, because the Amalekites were the pirates of the desert. They were reputed to be the dirtiest dealers of the ancient world. They also were known as the Hyksos, who had taken over Egypt after the 10 plagues, and the defeat of the Egyptian army left it defenseless when Israel left. Do you remember who the king of the Amalekites was? His name was Agag. Remember, Saul did not finish the job. A bunch of the king's sons got away. Talks about that in 1 Samuel 30, verse 17. And that, the king's sons that got away, is where the Agagites came from. That's who Haman's genealogy was from. Wow. So, the sons of Agag. So, guess who they had a blood feud with? The Jews. So, bingo. Now we know why Mordecai disrespected Haman, and why Haman hated all the people of Mordecai. Of course, now the bigger picture is that the devil was always out to destroy the Jews, because through them the Messiah would come. That's actually why they've been persecuted as a people, and actually why it has continued even now after the Messiah has come, because the adversary hates them for spite. He holds grudges. So, adding to that, I say that's why they deserve to rule the world in the millennial kingdom. Woohoo! So anyway, chapter 3, verse 8. Haman goes to the king, Ahasuerus, and he says, "There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to allow them to exist. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I'm going to pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries." And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. So he gave him the signet ring and said, "Here's the blank check." And the king said to Haman, "The silver is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." Wow. So the plan was genocide. Chapter 3, verse 12. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were over every province, and the rulers of every people of every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written, and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by post unto all the king's provinces to destroy, kill, and cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. The copy of the writing and the commandment to be given in every province, published to all people, that they should be ready against this day. So the post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Shushan was perplexed, because they didn't know why something like that would happen. Chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and cried with a loud and a bitter cry. There even came before the king's gate none that might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth, Because you see, one of the great rules, the Persian court was very formal. There was a lot of rules, and the penalty for breaking them was death. And one of the greatest rules in the Persian court was, don't bum out the king. Don't be sad in his presence. That is an infraction worthy of death. Don't make the king sad for any reason. It's party time all the time. Well, verse 3, in every province whithersoever the king's commandment went, his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Well, Esther found out what was going on, and Mordecai asked her to intercede with the king. In chapter 4, verse 11, she told Mordecai about those rules for the king's court. One of them was this, verse 11, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his, to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. So it was like, don't call us, we'll call you. Don't come in to the king's court without an invitation. See, that was a security measure to make sure the king would be safe. And the penalty for breaking that was death, unless the king saw you and he held out the golden scepter. Then you could live. But Esther said she had not been called to come into the king for a whole month. Verse 12. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with yourself that you shall escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. He said, you're going to be found out too that you're a Jew. For if thou altogether hold your peace at this time, then shall there be enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house shall be destroyed. And then he said, and who knows whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. You know, that happens with us a lot too. We're in the right place at the right time to do God's will if we follow through. See, we are God's representatives in our times. God's in the spiritual realm, and we're in the physical realm. And He needs us to do His work. Now, we don't know all the rules that define how all those realms work. Einstein couldn't figure it out either, like Ren said. But because words cross over and back between our realm and God's realm, that's why prayer works. It's also why believing is so important. Because we believe words. And words frame our acts and our expectations. So, God needs us to believe and act on His words here in the physical world where we are. And then He can enhance that. Our believing is like a catalyst in His chemistry. So, when God wants you to do something, we need to do it. Don't be afraid. Do it. Mordecai told Esther, who knows whether you are come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Who knows if what God has put upon your heart is why you exist? It's why you're here. So Esther and her maidens prayed for 3 days and 3 nights, and then she acted. Chapter 5, verse 1. Esther, chapter 5, verse 1. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel, and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. So she broke the law and came in unannounced, and is risking her life. And it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, so she could come in unannounced. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? And what is your request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom." See, he knew there had to be something important for her to violate that custom. Verse 4, and Esther answered, "If it seem good to the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." And the king said, "Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Now, then what happened? She had that banquet. She asked for a second one. And in chapter 5, verse 9, boy, Haman thinks he's the king of the world. Haman went forth that day joyful with a glad heart. But then on his way out, he saw Mordecai in the king's gate. And Mordecai didn't stand up. He didn't even move for him. And Haman was full of indignation against Mordecai. So Haman went home and told his wife about the banquet and about what Esther had done, and of course what Mordecai had done and how angry he was. But he was thinking, boy, Esther, the queen, has invited me to 2 wine-drinking parties. He anticipated that he'd be the most powerful man in the kingdom next to the king. So then his wife says in chapter 5, verse 14, Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, "Well, we know what to do with Mordecai. Let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, tall, and tomorrow speak to the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. And go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet." And that pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. But now those 3 days and 3 nights of prayers that Esther prayed, and all the other prayers of the Jews, started to take effect. Chapter 6, verse 1, that night the king couldn't sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. So he wanted the storybook to be read, but this one was what had happened in the court. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, of the king's eunuchs, the keepers of the door, who had sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor and dignity has been done to Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants said, ministered to him, said, nothing had been done for him. And the king said, "Well, all right, who was in the court?" Haman had just come in to the outer court of the king's house for the purpose of speaking to him to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared. And the king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman stands in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What do you say should be done to the man who the king delights to honor?" Now, Haman thought in his heart, "To whom would the king delight to honor more than myself?" So Haman answered the king, "For the man who the king delighteth to honor, let him be king for a day." Remember, like the old Queen for a Day TV show? "Let the royal apparel be brought, which the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king rides thereon, and the crown which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and the horse be delivered to the hand of the one the king most delights to honor, that they may array the man withal, whom the king delights to honor, and bring him on horseback through all the street of the city, and proclaim before him, all those noble princes that'll do that for him. Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delights to honor. Verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, you do this. Make haste. Take the apparel and the horse, just like you said, and do even to Mordecai, the Jew, that sits in the king's gate, and let nothing fail of all that you have spoken. Ha ha! What a reversal! And Haman had to do it. He had to honor Mordecai. Verse 11, then took Haman the herald and horse in array. Mordecai brought him on horseback through the street of the city and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. He's king for a day. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house, mourning, and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh's wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said the wise men and Zeresh's wife to him, your goose is cooked, man. If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him. Thou shalt surely fall before him. They knew they were doomed, because this thing was of God. That same God of the Jews that had done all those things to the Egyptians, and all the other things like the walls of Jericho falling, and all the other things, they knew that this God was at work. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's eunuchs and said, hey, you forgot about this appointment you had with the queen. Oh no! So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. Chapter 7, verse 2. And the king said again to Esther on the second day of the banquet, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It should be granted to you. What is your request? Why was it so important for you to risk your life? And it shall be performed even to the half of the kingdom. Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. What? What's going to kill you, Esther? You're the queen. How could that be? Verse 4, she said, for we are sold out, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, to be perished. But if we had been sold for bondmen and for bondwomen, then I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus and said to Esther the queen, who is he? Where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so to you? And Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman right here. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. Wow. The king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw there was evil determined against him by the king. You don't bum out the king. Don't piss off the king. And the king returned out of the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed where Esther was. He's begging with her. But the king said, will he force the queen also before me in the house? And the word went out of the king's mouth, and they covered Haman's face. He was not allowed to look on the king again. And Harbona, one of the king eunuchs, said before the king, hey, there's this gallows out there that Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good to the king. And he stands in the house of Haman. And the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and then the king's wrath was pacified. Woo! So they reversed all the plans that Haman had made, and they sent out the messengers throughout the kingdom, and instead of the Jews being killed on that day, they were armed and allowed to defend themselves against their enemies. And so, chapter 8, verse 7. Then the king Ahasuerus said to Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he had laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews, as is like you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. So now he's given her the blank check for the writing which was written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring. May no man reverse. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, wherein the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Chapter 10, verse 3, 4. Mordecai the Jew was next to King Ahasuerus. He became the grand vizier, the vice president of Persia, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. So, the events described in the book of Esther describe the serendipitous, the divine turn of events that brought the Jews to great prominence in the reign of Darius I. He was just another member of the team. The great key to understanding these events is that Haman was an Agagite, the sworn enemy of Israel, and so that's why they had that attempt at genocide. But God intervened, and Esther stood up and risked her life. Who knows whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Haman's intrigue was reversed, and the Jews prevailed, and that is the origin of the celebration of Purim, a Jewish festival that occurs on Adar, the 12th month, on the 14th and 15th day, late winter, early spring. That would have been, I think, 509 BC. We'll have to check that. But this is the book of Esther, and now we understand more about God's team and why the Jews had such great influence during the reign of Darius I. So, bless you.